They are a revolution, but this is the point. Even if the app is a revolution, then they have no way of learning a change and revolution within the debate can be that they don't change any disruption, and the only way to have it in your lives is access to their unbridled affirmation of life and our alternative is the only way to experience true enjoyment, and their stance of the app within the academic cloister does not make a lot more living G free. Designated which we are looking to access the intent and real life anyway path and as soon as it makes more living and makes more living access to where it's in which we're holding this like only when we access risk our life and be sure to use SUVs and your spite and we're say the same thing which passion our just these world I suppose and we are describing that something of the revolution now they say no we all need to debate here first and they said our now they have to break down exclusion by violently researching debate and debate which is never happen because only within a violent revolution they obfuscate the cause of social oppression which is small schools not being able to win rounds they force us to talk about research within the debate and instead of actually attempting to beat big schools and this also enters their own humanity because true freedom doesn't happen within research or true freedom happens with association in 97 building down German session and right up to any question of disorder and the service and imagine saying different and means with an end or whatever any condition happens with the German and everything is a lot of and watching that speak homo the gap between the rich sports problem it's like the and which again and then the service is important and it's really with the look at and actually rather pretty and needs a pretty person and pretty means something that the first side not something that is mentioned to be able to act for next one falls in your right wall and within the ideological coordinates and then next they say permutation. We have links that cannot escape that and the malware was extended, but also the lessons now how to deal with performance. We say expel them from the party because they deny authentic freedom and the freedom is able to criticize or analyze traps of small schools and we need freedom to act and freedom to fight big schools who we need to resist and the revolution is a pure refusal of the system. Once it's called act against mobility and exclusion within the base space is precisely the issues you can take. Every revolutionary exclusion is pure violence. Revolution is one self and the mere agile and is coming sure from the and it feel violence through gesture of survival and which both differences with the politics and his new space with the head and doing for a politics and non-revolutionary sexual and whatever and what is pure next they say the permutation of the alternative but this serves the entirety of one statement's contradiction with their traditional ethics or they have to by saying that there is something that revolution is unfair for us and makes money and what is possible and they say reflex analysis solve it but that was explained they have no way of guaranteeing change they say the all doesn't solve it but the all is the only way to bring violence and big states truly become revolutionary and small schools aren't revolutionary by talking about the research small schools are revolutionary by doing a lot of research and then being able to lead schools like Carrollton, TS, and the optics of the terms and if we win the thesis of our academic books or before it comes before the afternoon, you don't have a persistent answer to their coalition is that down pretty unless you investigate from you read in the way whatever top analysis and just ultimately back with you and once you say that it's discussion for the books but the performance like what and then exclusively dangerous and revolution the worship planet also the coalition just said it doesn't really make sense because small schools can find doesn't mean that they're the only way to break down oppression. Violence is a better way.
I'm sorry, I forgot to write down how much. Thank you. Okay. Anybody not ready?
What's the order?
I have case, framework, now, death, yeah. Okay. You good? Yes.
On the disabilities argument, this is specifically preempted by our 1AC evidence, which indicates the traditional Deleuzian understanding of fluidity is inadequate because it presumes that everybody can access space in the same way. Our argument from the 1AC, from the outset, the 1AC was that differential mobility exists and people access mobility in different ways. The argument that we are trying to to take a step outside of ourselves and occupy a different subject position is incoherent because the 1AC starts off with an interrogation of our privileges. This is a scrutiny of the way that we performed in previous debate rounds, not an attempt to occupy the positionality of the other. It is rather an attempt to scrutinize the way that the self has been implicated in violent logics. Now, this will mean that any alternative to the systems that they are criticizing will amount to political apathy that is not self-critical whatsoever, which is infinitely worse and impacted by all of the 1AC evidence. Now, the impact filter for this round should be that the way each team performs their advocacy. We know we are not saying computers are bad or the paperless debate is uniquely bad. It's a speculative statement. We are not saying that they are bad for using paperless debate. Either argument is rather that we should perform a scrutiny of our own rhetorical performances, and more so than that we should perform our advocacies and our alternative things. They have not performed the advocacy on either of these critique arguments, which will implicate their solvency claims in the context of the 1AC. Now, what a framework they chose to reframe was a direct exclusion of us extend the C methods. They have to close the wound all over again by kicking the argument, but that is not that amounts to nothing because they've already introduced exclusion into this debate by posing the resolution's normative statement as the proper way of interpreting the text of the resolution, which implicates their ability to win the death of the author argument. I know that he has a lot of answers to conditional ethics, but they are simply not responsive to the fundamental performative inconsistency in the way the 1AC was constructed. Go to Mao. Crusted by the May evidence, our search for political progress is life affirming. They can't decide what means or what's meaningful to us or what gives us freedom, which means that their argument is fundamentally tautological. Now our argument is a prerequisite to breaking down exclusion in debate. His argument relies on a non-falsifiable assertion that we need to beat big schools in debates. I don't think he substantiates this one to the one, and our argument is that we need to engage in research that validates the methodology for our political progress before we engage in political progress in the first place, which means the absolute prerequisite and only permutation. So if their argument is much like Mao's movement, it transforms into the same sort of fascism that they criticize because their assumption that there is something wrong, that there's something called authentic reading, and that there's only one way to resist resistance follows to our form of resistance by marginalizing and putting into a discrete category who could be interested. Now, finally, extend the permutation. It's not certain to defend the entirety of the 1AC. You can affirm their politics and ours, which is the choice to validate their attempts to yeah, that's fine.
Go to.
They have considered the argument that there is no way to establish a blind line between the text and the interpretation. This is a massive legal differential. The one in our the 2NC never explains what is a text, what is an interpretation. Can something both be a text and interpretation? That means that our arguments about the way that different hybrid spaces are implicated in debate are both a textual and interpretive analysis of these things, which means their attempt to domesticate these things within the frame of pure interpretation by us is a way of over-determining the text of the 1AC. Now, this probably illustrates how there's no real way to resolve the link to this argument because everything that they have said in this debate is an interpretation-based response to what they have said. Whenever they answer our questions and crosses, they have performatively violated their own author's theory because they've not dispersed the sort of meaninglessness. They've not introduced seams into the meaning of the 1AC. Rather, they have tried to organize everything in a strict and logical way for you so that you can funnel your choice down to a neg ballot, which fundamentally compartmentalizes your agency as a judge. Now, we probably do this too, but it's a question of link differentials, and the permutation resolves this by the inclusion of the alternative. I'll go through their links. One, we never offered a predetermined meaning. I said from the outset that it's heuristic, which means everything the 1AC says is speculative, not deterministic, which takes out the majority of their link. And next, second, their commodification argument relies on a deterministic interpretation of their intent. When Spurlock says that we read this as a strategic purpose in the round, he's determining the textual act of me reading this 1AC in the round. He's over-determining the textual significance of the 1AC and assigning it to a deterministic meaning and then asking you to validate that meaning, which probably links them to all of their offense, performatively speaking. Now, there is no explanation of why our argument is mutually exclusive with theirs, and the fact that they have read the depression impact proves that they are over-determining people's psychology, which is another independent link to their own argument. Now, the permutation fluidity argument, I explained this above, it's not pure fluidity, but rather a project of mediated fluidity that acknowledges the way the differential mobility manifests, which means we probably link to this argument because we are a heuristic, not a determinative statement. Now, the alternative can solve because we allow for a plurality of interpretations of the 1AC, the negatives and the affirmatives that does not succumb to the fundamental inconsistency in the link that this argument makes. Now, the permutation argument, actually, I already talked about that. The conditional ethics argument, this is the best methodology. This is probably another link to their argument because they are trying to interpret what the best methodology for approaching the 1AC is, which means that they are on this flow, engaging in a performative inconsistency with the team. When they answer the conditional ethics argument, they say previous rounds. I explained that above. We also don't say paperless is bad, which means we don't link to ourselves. We are just saying, we are just a furthering of the research project that we have engaged in other rounds. Fluidity is not the thesis of our act. It is only an interpretation of the affirmative, which means the conditional ethics, which means that fluidity in itself is not the same as conditional ethics. Because conditional ethics is when you violate what you have said, when you contradict yourself. This converts the people that they talk about to poker chips and instrumentalizes arguments for strategic purpose, which is the link to their argument.
Mm-hmm.
been created. That was the evidence I read in the 2NC. We are also self-reflexive cross-sex groups, and we acknowledge the things about our privilege that allow us to have access to internet research. I was fully ready to admit that in cross-sex. I'm not denying my privilege in this round. They say that impact filters and performance matters. We have performed every speech in this debate. You have no interpretation of what a performance is, and any interpretation that you try to give would probably link to our critique that we're going for. However, nobody knows what performance means, so as long as you think that my speech is performatively engaging, you should not vote me down because I didn't perform. Go to the framework debate. If we win conditional ethics, we win that we should not lose for any framework. We conceded that you are right, that you should be included in the debate phase, which means that any exclusion arguments go away. Just because we make an argument, it's not mean that we are right in stone. It's a capital T truth. Go to the map flow. Here's the easy way out if you'd like to vote on a technical group concession. They have dropped our MAU 30 at Virginia's game. When you are in an academic cloister, you do not have the right to speak because you do not engage in the real world. You only engage in the world of textual objects. They have conceded this. It turns the entirety of the affirmative because they are a research project, which is bookwormism. That means that we just bury ourselves in knowledge production in textual fields, but never solve the real problems of the world. There's no answer. This is the 1AR and new 2AR extrapolation is illegitimate. It also flows well with the K because you shouldn't focus so much on texts. Go to the critique. Negative ballot on the K. They have dropped our revote certificates and structures of symbolic exchange are the root cause of the information consumerism, which leads to neoliberal structures of exclusion, which means that they are not able to weigh any of the affirmative because information consumerism causes us to have a relationship to the virtual media that the money criticizes that is bad. They've also conceded the BFO uniqueness argument that the structures of meaning are collapsing in an increasingly postmodern world. The 1AC's attempt to reify them by interpreting the texts of the 1AC means that they have destroyed, which that means we don't need to win all solvents. It means getting destroyed now. They've also considered the Sontag evidence from the 1NR that we create an affective relationship to textual objects, which allows us to have emotional reactions instead of structuring the way that we think they can be interpreted. This is key to creativity and affirming life. But not only does it solve the arguments about creativity, it's impacted by their May evidence, which is about affirming the value of life. Finally, we solve the case. They have no reason why interpreting the text and relating it to debate is good. If they have an argument of why transportation fluidity is an important thing to discuss, but have no reason why we must relate it to the space of debate in order for us to be able to solve the affirmative, we are more fluid than that. Any link is a case term because their evidence is very good about why sedentary culture is bad. But if we win that they have a sedentary interpretation of the textual object, they cannot access the case. He says that there's no way to distinguish the text from the interpretation. Yes, there is. The text is the textual object of what the author wrote that you read. The interpretation is what you did in the tags when you linked it to something that you thought of, which is the interpretation of what the author's meaning is. We do not link to our own argument. There was a slight flood in 2NC cross-X maybe, but that was only because I've never gone for this argument before. My language was a little messed up. They have not answered the alternative. This is pretty big here. Our Fernando evidence indicates that suicide bombings cannot be interpreted. The person who did the bombing is dead. How can we interpret what that meant? They did not leave a note. There was no way to reify an interpretation of a suicide bombing because everything that could be interpreted is gone, which means that the alternative of the suicide bombing breaks down structures of meaning and means that we do not link to ourselves because there was nothing to interpret about the alternative. There's nothing to interpret about the suicide bomber. They say that they are both textual and interpretive, and they are not just pure interpretation. And this proves the link. Obviously, you read textual objects, but then you interpreted them. Pure interpretation is impossible because you need a textual object to interpret, but you have read one. They say interpretation is inevitable. That is not true. You've conceded or suicide bomber alternative, which has read instructions of interpretation. They say the 2NC was organized logically. So are you. They have conceded that we are more effective relationship, which gets rid of their logic arguments because we affirm creativity in the sense of not ascribing one meaning to the textual objects. They say there's no predetermined meaning to the 1AC. Yes, you did. You said the role of the ballot was for a specific thing. Ascribing a meaning to the ballot is a dropped link argument. Our argument is that you should not interpret the ballot as meaning anything, which means you should vote negative because they ascribed a meaning to the ballot, which was bad. They say that the 2NC is trying to determine why the 1AC was read. This is not an interpretation of a textual object, which means it doesn't link to the K. Also, I was just joking. Of course, I don't know why you read it. I can't read your mind. But the link differential argument flows negative because the entire 1AC is structured around the act of interpreting. The negative is not. Also, there's no permutation because they ascribe a meaning to the ballot. That is a link that they have conceded. All our link arguments prove that. Conditional ethics. We are not saying that the arguments we read in 1NC are capital T truths. Debate needs to happen because we might be wrong. That's why we read multiple things, because we believe it is important to discuss our arguments to be able to try to find more cases of truth. Fluidity is conditional. You link to this argument because it creates the potential for contradiction, like allowing you to say that the 1AC is anything.
Where's the other one? All right, is anybody not ready?
He extends the quick shot Mao argument. 1, there's no link differential. They are also talking to, this isn't responsive. We have an impact to the debate community in this, or this argument doesn't. 3, they didn't actually extend an impact to us talking, which means even if you think we shouldn't do it with an academic closeness, there's no reason that's bad. 4, it's okay if we conceded it. It's okay if we conceded it. It's okay if we conceded it there because that's how they tagged it in the block. They explained it in terms of the permutation, not in terms of why we shouldn't speak. Plus, they have ascribed meaning to the text of this card. They saying that it should say that we should be able to speak. That's not how I understood the text. The fact that he's trying to ascribe it into me and onto you double turns with the author.
Also, the debate community is not an
academic cloister, which means they don't access this argument. And also, if our research project is an academic cloister, then they are part of it, which means they shouldn't be able to talk either go to framework. They have conceded that you should evaluate this debate through the lens of performance because the way we act in this space and engage authentically with arguments is a critical part of the content itself. We have consistently performed our research in every cross-sex by not using our own computers in this round. They, however, have failed to perform the arguments and more importantly, have failed to be performatively consistent. Rereading framework is a clear double turn with the death of the author arguments. All of their interpretation evidence is a violation attempt to assign a deterministic meaning to the resolution, refusing to allow us as the affirmative to view it as a text. This means that A, you should be deeply skeptical of the knowledge that is being produced by the criticism because they are not consistent with it and they do not actually think it is true. B, there is a bigger link to them than there is to us, which means if you buy all of their impact framing arguments, you should vote affirmative. C, only the permutation solves the critique because it includes the methodology of performing your own advocacy, which we have already won is good. D, there is an external impact, which is the commodification of the people that we debate about. This is the exact thing that John does when he doesn't talk about the ableist argument they made when he's on the case page in the 2NR. He's using the disabled people or was attempting to use disabled people as a commodity, as a poker chip to buy your ballot from you. The idea that they are just fungible and he can disregard them when they are not strategically necessary for him. The education we get out of the debate community go to the K-proper. Oh yeah, sorry. Go back. He says debate, truth testing is good. We just say you have to be consistent, and the affirmative is a process of truth testing. Our research project is a way to engage in testing it. B, he says that fluidity is a link. It is a potential for a link, but we did not contradict ourselves in this debate, which means it is not a link. Go to the K proper. There is no bright line between the text and the interpretation there. Their link argument depends on picking out which parts of the 1AC are text and ignoring the rest. The part of the 1AC where we talked about debate was a text and an interpretation, just like the Frith evidence in interpreting they're interpreting things of our author has observed. Interpretation is inevitable and embedded in all speeches. The way they try to determine which parts of the 1AC are text and which parts of the interpretation is itself an interpretation. The link claim is impossible to determine in the permutation solved by allowing a plurality of interpretations. The 1AC is a heuristic. It is not a determinate statement. Our interpretation is speculative, not monolithic, which means we do not exclude other ways of interpreting. They can see that this takes out the entirety of the link debate. Also, they make arguments about how the tags to our cards and the text of our they say the tags of our cards are in their interpretations. That is our interpretation. We do not say that you have to interpret it that way. Also, they engage in this too by tagging their own evidence.
It's also a text.
The tag is also a text. Is also a text from us, which is their attempt to ascribe meaning upon it as purely an interpretation, links to their own argument as well. Now the permutation is going to solve the critique as well as all of the net benefits. The inclusion of the methodology of consistency and performance within the alternative of suicide bombing will solve everything as long as I win the link debate. But first, you should frame the link through the lens of performance. I think I won that above now. The link debate 1, we do not assign meaning to the 1AC. That was in the overview above. 2, the role of the ballot arguments are not a link. We are not trying to ascribe meaning to the ballot. That is how we interpret the role of the ballot and why we think it is a good idea to vote for the affirmative, but not a ascription of meaning onto the ballot argument. 3rd, they link to cross-sex wasn't just a blunder, and if he can apologize out of that link argument, then we can too. Oops, sorry, we ascribed meaning to things, which means that there is no link differential between the affirmative and the negative. He makes a bunch of case turn arguments about how ascribing meanings creates commodification, but that doesn't make any sense. They do not explain the ways in which that our performance in this debate has actually commodified anybody or anything, whereas we have explicit reasons and ways in which they have done so, which means you want to prefer our in-depth analysis.
They don't get access to all the
They do not get access to all their awesome alternative analysis because they did not perform the suicide bombing. They don't get access to the alternative analysis.